You know, I don't want to sound racist. However, Western and Japanese games feel very different. I'm going to be making very broad generalizations to this point, and you'll probably be able to think of games that buck these trends. But they're the exceptions, not the rules. In the West, our typical developer values immersion a lot more than input complexity, even at the expense of input reliability. I'll give a really easy comparison for this. The Japanese Metal Gear Solid 5 goes to painful lengths to never contain camera cuts. It's probably the biggest flaw of the game's cinematography, that it strives for something so fickle and time-consuming. And yet, watch me and this dog get into this vehicle. The camera actually cuts, and you just kinda teleport in with a very brief cutscene showing you did so. It's fast, it's responsive, but like I said, it's the biggest breaking of an otherwise holistic approach to the one-shot tracking camera design. That's how important this was. In comparison, let's have a look at a British/American game like Grand Theft Auto 5. Here, you just have to be within a certain distance of a vehicle. Your character has a dedicated pathfinding function. You can somewhat influence this found path without breaking away from it, but it's inarguably very automatic. Note most of all that instead of teleporting into the car during a cutscene too, animations painstakingly tween to show your embarkment, never breaking shot continuity. This is extremely immersive, it's very elegant, and helps novice and lazy players alike, and the camera never breaks off for a minute. At the same time, it's unresponsive, muddy feeling, and overall lacks a sense of urgency that you'd expect from a game with as much combat as Grand Theft Auto. We've all been killed trying to swap cars in a cop chase, right? Yes, if doors are obstructed, it's sometimes possible to teleport into a car, but this is very much a failsafe rather than a primary system. We'll see if I'm able to even get footage of that. Something as basic as an everyday task like entering a car has this kind of wide disparity between design philosophies. Another fun example is Assassin's Creed. Carried forward to this day, the climbing system is this slow, jaunty, but an extremely fluid simulation of a human convincingly rock climbing on urban terrain. A complex system of tweening, animation rigging, and independent AI are used to make this look as painfully convincing as absolutely possible. It's so well made that you cannot scale up smooth walls, as there are no pathing nodes on them. And Breath of the Wild just lets Link climb up walls. This system is achieved by detecting the verticality of a surface and automatically defining it as climbable. The surface can be as smooth and perfectly rounded as Zelda's ass, and Link would still maintain his foothold like a Skyrim horse. This isn't convincing, it isn't arduously put together, this is merely a shifting of state machine to a wall scaling mode. The only intrusion of any simulation here is that when it rains, Link slides like an itsy bitsy spider. These are very minor game mechanic comparisons, of course, but my point is how, when given the exact same basic concept, you'll find that Western developers want to create something that looks physically detailed, whilst Japanese developers want to create something that's snappy and responsive, making it feel physical, but ultimately feeling more game-like as well. So, let's take a relatively unique game concept and see how both cultures deal with it. Remedy's Max Payne 2 and Platinum's Vanquish. Both are hyper-stylish third-person shooters with bullet time mechanics limited by meters that focus largely on set-piece challenges in a linear story-driven progression. Sequel to the critically acclaimed Max Payne 2 The Fall of Max Payne follows protagonist Max Payne. He stumbles upon Mona Sachs, whom he'd thought to be a dead woman. Unfortunately for her, she's just his type. Everyone Max loves is dead. To the backdrop of this guy's miserable life, the gameplay has you exploring very detailed, somewhat simulated environments filled with mise-en-scène elements, like operatable doors and applied animations for Max prodding things to no avail, with appropriate sound effects. Being a game from 2003, there isn't a magnetic cover system, so your mode of play is actually trying to avoid fire through intentionally standing behind walls and tactically strafing around to avoid getting hit. This is made easier by slow motion and shooting mobsters before they shoot you. Vanquish is a game by Shinji Mikami of Resident Evil fame. It's set in an apocalyptic future where Russia's homophobia finally goes too far. In revenge, America elects a female president to avenge the game journalist by corrupting space with capitalism. Your journey takes you behind the scenes and into the living space of this colony as you wage war with your homies, firing upon robots. The interactability of this space is at an all-time low, but the cover system is detailed enough that it allows you to make use of even knee-high cover too. Some cover is destructible in a pre-designed kind of way, making it another resource for you to manage alongside your regenerating health and ammo counts. Just looking at these two games alongside one another, you can see they're clearly more alike than they aren't in how they play. But every design decision made in their detail gives the games two completely different flavors. Let's look at movement. Max Payne 2 is, in some ways, a really rough platformer. Max has a grounded physicality to his movement, leading to him looking far less acrobatic than Vanquish's Sam. But in reality, the game asks him to perform far more acrobatic stunts. He has a functional jump, which allows stages to not only look more like a depiction of the gritty New York streets, but it allows Max to work around the spaces that he's in. It lets you feel more in touch with those spaces by having to think about them in meaningful ways. If Max is locked down in his apartment building, it's up to you to figure out that windows exist, as does the outdoors, and that you can jump between poorly maintained balcony ledges. The player toolkit is a sandbox of myriad functions, allowing Max to face a variety of challenges often at once, and allowing the designers to build realistic-seeming livable spaces first, and then retrofit challenge into them by creating a scenario that forces you to meet his neighbors and watch them die like everyone else. Vanquish, however, is an entirely combat-driven game. The spectacle is usually around a given combat situation, rather than provoking or complicating it. In fact, you'll probably be so involved in this intense action, you entirely miss that spaceships are crashing into shit around you, filling out the ambiance of an ongoing war that you're only one single, highly proficient part of. Rather than involving you in the story through the gameplay itself, character-driven cutscenes play out. This, whilst being far from what we idealize in games as story, gives the gameplay a damning purity. As a trend, these scenarios exist to produce interesting situations rather than push the narrative's agenda. Sam does have a jump function, but it's really a way to scale cover or jump at set climb points, usually signified by a ladder, which has a really unexpectedly logical comedic value. Really, this game's about lateral movement. While Sam doesn't exactly sprint, he can, however, slide on his rocket-powered ass like a madman. The replenishing boost gauge is tied to both this and your slow motion meter, which is intended to allow you to actually be able to shoot moving targets whilst you're moving this damn fast. Here's where the distinctions between Western and Japanese design become focal. In Max Payne 2, slow motion is a generic tool. There's a jump dodge button which cinematically has Max dive like a badass, using no meter, of course. But the actual bullet time mode is a toggle button for you to do with as you see fit. You can turn it on to shoot people with, dodging through their bullets with all the grace of Max's clumsy heavy movement. Or you can use it to aid you in platforming. You could even use it after you throw a grenade just to watch the ragdolls flail around. It's just another tool in your arsenal to do with as you please. That tool is generally part of a planning ritual. Around corners, enemies chatter amusingly, keying you into their location, giving you the drop. And from there, it's up to you how you're going to approach them. Sometimes it's a room for you to breach. Sometimes you're hiding behind the thinnest of walls or physics objects as they approach, and create a time-sensitive scenario that you can augment if you want with that slow motion. This requires a combination of your assessment skill to determine who should die first based on their weapons or vicinity, perhaps where your closest cover will be, and then your spontaneity based on the shit plan you came up with within the soft time limit of their approach, or your best laid plans faltering and landing you in deeper shit when you hadn't realized that you ran out of pistol ammo. Combined with Max's somewhat chunky, realistic and weighty movement, where a low landing or sending him crashing into the floor requires him to collect himself without shooting, you embody a man who's trying desperately to maintain control as things around him in the world spiral out of control, by throwing yourself headfirst at every situation with only the thinnest of plans. Sam, however, isn't a man who ruminates. He's an optimistic action hero in the vein of cheesy American hero movies, combined with a very Japanese exoskeleton to contextualize his powers. The emphasis here is by and large on Sam's very fast and acrobatic looking movement, but unlike Max, your slow motion is only manually activated once you aim or fire your gun, whilst doing an acrobatic movement. In a way, this is similar to Max's jump dodge, but Sam, rather than suddenly sacrificing his body, performs a cool pose out of these dodges and plants his feet and starts sniping. You can jump over cover and activate it in midair, hanging there to get a good vantage for headshots. Or you can jump off enemies for the same reason using your melee. Slow motion is a highly contextual action in Vanquish which you have to more tactically deploy, and tactically you must. The largest heads up you get in most scenarios is watching a squadron of enemies fall in. Unless you're on a second playthrough, there's no real planning to be done. You're flying by the seat of your robotic pants. and your capability to quickly assess the situation as you act is constantly being tested. The final context for slow motion is once you're reduced to a minimal amount of life. It burns through the last of your boost meter, finally letting you augment time around every other function you have, like Max Payne 2. This is critical to saving your ass, finding cover, or eliminating the remaining threats before, your time's up. Whether you burnt your meter away overextending yourself or nearly getting killed, Sam without rest of his boost meter is left, not feeling entirely unlike Max actually. His jump dodge has similar frames and you become a slow, staggering mess. That might be the most interesting part of this comparison. Sam at his worst is Max at his best. Being from the creator of Resident Evil 4 and developed by Character Action Warehouse Platinum, you can count on you being very well equipped to wing every situation, whilst looking like the coolest bastard alive. In fact, at the end of every level, you're scored based on your proficiency, including a rather judgmental percentage of time that you spent behind cover. Not even propped against it, even just behind it. The game wants you to be risking your damn life every second. It's quite arcade-like, really. The Japanese are always some years ahead of us technologically, but they're also entrenched in tradition. In this case, to the arcade market. Probably because it was the last time they weren't in an economic crisis. I believe this is where Japan and the West differ. We stop trying to quantify success. All we care about is that you do succeed, and not even if you do it very well. Most games we'd call Japanese are constantly evaluating your proficiency through a given segment of gameplay, sometimes on a second-to-second basis. To return back to my original analogies of GTA 5 and Assassin's Creed, your personal proficiency at a game would be indeterminate if you were half relying on the overbearing AIs that those games have. Especially to do something as simple as enter a vehicle or climb a wall for you. You can become adept at manipulating these types of helpful AI, certainly, but that's impure to a systematic arcade-like challenge, and it's still relatively unpredictable despite their elegance. As well, those complicating measures of Max Payne 2's design would create impurities within the play space of a more Japanese game. Such cinematic elements exist outside the fishbowl of your play space in Vanquish, or exist within small cinematic corridors dedicated to the event. Perhaps the Japanese simply value a different form of elegance than us. Now, not every difference between the two games has to do with the locality with which they were made. I should distinguish that many differences between these two games are generally their differing vintage. Funnily, mostly in just the raw presentation. Shinji Mikami defined what a shoulder shooter was with Resident Evil 4, and followed the Western evolution of this control style into Vanquish. Your camera is off-center, generally having Sam occupy a lower third of the screen, framing his perspective of the action for you. You're in there, with Sam, from his perspective. This design trend bucks when you run away, and the camera starts to hover overhead, giving you a wider view as you retreat. The typical camera in Max Payne. As the series that defined third-person shooting even, more or less, Max Payne 2 has the camera hang above him, looking somewhat down at the world, necessitating that every room and corridor be 14 foot tall to accommodate it. But what is a controllable camera if not an inelegant solution? As a character action game, you're meant to control Sam, and yet the camera is almost distinct from him. You can run in directions that don't adhere to it, allowing us to see things he isn't facing. In television, the term fourth wall is another name for the invisible barrier between the viewer and the stage. That wall might well be considered the lens of the camera. But here, we are both the main character and the cameraman, and our impetus as chief cinematographer is situational awareness, often exceeding the logic of our other role, the protagonist. In these games, the fourth wall is in an obsessive, controllable orbit around one person. Max has a third-person camera that, whilst more locked to your controlled character than Vanquish, still has you able to see things he wouldn't be able to see diegetically to the situation. And yet, despite that third-person camera, Max's story is a first-person narration. Is that third-person camera a framing of retrospect that allows Max to add in later knowledge to a prior situation, i.e., those guys around the corner that he ended up shooting? What bearing does this have on Sam's story when he has an active awareness of things outside of his actual peripheral view? I can see past this cover, and I control him. Is this heightened instinct from his suit, or battle experience or something? A more important question might be, is it necessary to explain this? For some reason, it's accepted without a second thought by players. Maybe it's tradition or functional necessity. Or maybe there's something inherently ununified about people in the first place. I don't mean as a group, I mean individually ununified. Like our instincts tell us things that we shouldn't inherently know, for instance. We have innate fears of things like falls or pain or things approaching at high speed. We even have genetic fears for specific organisms like snakes and spiders. How do you really know you're hungry or thirsty? In extreme cases there are physical symptoms, of course, but day to day you simply know you're hungry. You become aware of your thirst. You'll know how strong your instincts are if you've ever had to be stuck underwater, unable to save yourself, trying to hold your breath. Eventually your body overpowers you, and it will try to breathe anyway. Perhaps this is why we can easily accept a third-person camera. Maybe we aren't as individual as we imagine. Thank you for watching. I've been Gitai, and remember, thank you for watching.